Ireland, October 1887. The sky over Galway Bay was bruised with cloud when Bridget Malloy folded the letter with trembling hands. Her fingers were red from the chill, her gloves worn thin. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the words, "I am a man of few needs and fewer words. My land is honest. I will treat you the same. If you still intend to come, arrive before the first snow. Monsieur Callahan, Coldwater Ridge, Montana Territory." It wasn't poetry, but it was a door, and Bridget had no others left to knock on. Her father was gone, her brothers lost to hunger and ships, and Ireland, well, Ireland had grown tired of trying to keep her alive. She was strong, yes, resourceful. But the village made no room for unmarried women who asked questions and didn't know when to bow. So she packed the wool coat she'd mended 10 times over, tucked her mother's silver cross beneath her collar, and boarded a ship bound for New York. From there it was trains, then more trains, then a cart through a frozen pass where horses nearly refused to go. And by the time she reached Coldwater Ridge, the snow had begun to fall sideways. The town was small, no more than 20 buildings huddled against the wind like they were praying not to be forgotten. A general store, a post, a saloon that leaned a little to the left, and at the end of the street, the church. Empty, hollow. Bridget stepped off the wagon, boots sinking into half-melted slush, and looked around. No one waited. No man named Callahan. Just wind and cold and a silence that felt like a warning. The driver tipped his hat. "This is as far as I go." She nodded, forcing her spine straight. "I'll manage." He glanced at her again, frowning. "Miss, are you sure this is what you signed up for?" Bridget looked toward the snow-covered ridge behind the church, where smoke curled faintly from a cabin roof. "I didn't come for comfort," she said. "I came for land. And if I find kindness too, well then, that's a miracle I'll earn." She walked up the hill herself, through snow, through silence, and at the door of the cabin she knocked. Once, twice, then again. A long moment passed before the door opened, and there stood a tall man, broad-shouldered, with frost on his beard, and a rifle slung casually at his side. His eyes were dark, quiet, not cruel, but not welcoming either. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked, voice steady. He nodded once. "You're early." She blinked. "It's snowing sideways." "I said before the first snow." Bridget squared her shoulders. "And I made it." He stared at her for a long, unreadable moment, then stepped aside. "Then come in." The cabin was small, warm, plain. A fire burned, a kettle steamed, no woman's touch, but not untended either. She stood by the hearth, unbuttoning her coat with trembling fingers. "You never wrote back," she said without looking at him. "I figured if you were serious, you'd come anyway." "And if I wasn't?" He shrugged. "Then I didn't waste time waiting." Bridget turned slowly. "You're not what I imagined." "Good." Then he looked at her, really looked. "You're not either." And for a breathless second, something like curiosity passed between them. Not affection, not trust, but possibility. The kind that could bloom in a place where even fire dared not die. The next morning the world was white. Not soft snowfall white, but blinding, wind-cutting, breath-stealing white. The kind of snow that swallowed fences, buried roads, and made you question if spring had ever existed. Bridget rose early, fingers numb as she pulled on boots still stiff from travel. Her body ached from the cold night. Though the cabin had stayed warm from the fire she had kept alive, Callahan hadn't said much after letting her in, just offered her the cot, handed her a wool blanket, and said, "Chop more wood tomorrow." No welcome, no smile, but no cruelty either, just quiet survival. She stepped outside, breath misting. The trees groaned in the wind. Snow crunched beneath her feet like glass, and across the valley below, she saw it. Coldwater Ridge. Still small, still struggling. She could spot maybe 4 chimneys still smoking. A few people shuffled between the general store and the livery. A sign outside the saloon hung lopsided, its paint nearly stripped away by years of cold. And the church? Empty. Its doors half open. Bridget narrowed her eyes. A place like this wouldn't survive long without community. But Coldwater Ridge looked like it had forgotten how to be together. Or maybe it had been taught not to. Back inside the cabin, Callahan was splitting logs with clean, brutal precision. She watched him from the corner for a while, then finally asked, "What happened to this town?" He didn't stop chopping. "Winter happened. Winter always happens." He paused, axe midair. "This one came too early. Too hard. Took half the cattle before we could butcher. Took the road to the south. Took the doctor's wagon last week." Bridget's breath caught. "Doctor? Died trying to get to a birth. Baby didn't make it either." A long silence. She stepped closer. Is there a midwife? Was. He didn't say more. Didn't need to. Bridget nodded slowly. And what about you, Mr. Callahan? Do you always survive storms alone? He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw it. Not loneliness, not pride, but grief worn down into habit. That afternoon she walked into town, alone, past the church, past the saloon, into the general store where a single man, thin, nervous, middle-aged, stood behind the counter. He looked up in surprise. Well now, you're not from here. I am now, she said calmly. You the bride he never mentioned? I'm Bridget Malloy, and I'm not waiting for an introduction. He blinked, then offered a small, awkward smile. Jonas Fields. I run the store and sometimes the post if the snow lets me. Bridget glanced at the shelves. Thin supplies, dust on corners. You expecting more stock? Not till the thaw, Jonas said, scratching his chin, which, by the look of it, might not come till spring. Bridget turned. And what about the church? His face darkened. What about it? It's wide open, no fire, no preacher. No one goes there anymore. Why not? He hesitated, then whispered, because that's where the McKinnon girl died last winter. Locked in. Fever. No one came. Bridget's throat tightened. Jonas lowered his voice. We all learned something after that, Miss Malloy. What's that? Hope gets you hurt. Bridget left the store with a small sack of oats and a sharper clarity. This town didn't just need warmth. It needed reminding of what it meant to feel worth saving. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't come here to be saved herself. Maybe she came to save something much bigger. The next morning, Bridget rose before the sun. Coldwater Ridge still slept beneath its blanket of snow, the trees groaning under the weight of white silence. Inside the cabin, Callahan was already chopping kindling with the same methodical distance he wore like armor. Bridget tightened her shawl and pulled on her boots. I'm going to the church, she said simply. Callahan didn't look up. No one's been in there since last winter. Then it's about time someone went back. A pause. The stove's broken, he muttered. The roof leaks. Bridget walked to the door. I wasn't asking for a building that works, just a place that remembers. The chapel doors moaned when she pushed them open. Inside, it smelled of mildew and old wood. The pews were scattered with snow blown in from the broken windows. Icicles clung to the rafters like brittle fingers. But beneath the cold, there was silence. Not the kind that choked, the kind that waited. She moved to the altar, her breath visible, her gloves stiff. A torn hymnal lay beside the pulpit. She picked it up and turned a page. Come ye weary, she smiled sadly. Maybe they will, she whispered, if we give them somewhere to go. That afternoon, she returned to Callahan's cabin with her arms full of cloth, firewood, and a battered brass kettle she found in the shed behind the church. Callahan raised a brow. You planning a funeral? A resurrection, she replied. He stared at her, then turned back to the fire without a word. The next 2 days she worked, scrubbed pews, rehung the crooked cross, repaired the cracked stovepipe with nothing but tin and wire, hauled snow to melt for cleaning, all while the wind howled through Coldwater Ridge like it meant to erase what little warmth she tried to create. She didn't stop, and slowly word began to spread. At first it was just Jonas from the store, stepping inside with a handful of nails. Then a rancher's wife dropping off a stack of wool blankets with no explanation. A teenage boy brought kindling. No one stayed long, no one said much. But Bridget kept going, because someone had to go first. On the 7th morning, she lit the stove before dawn and placed a sign out front made from a fence slat and her own frozen handwriting. Church open, coffee hot, fires free. And then she waited, hands folded, heart beating louder than the wind. The first to come was a child, maybe 8, with tangled hair and a runny nose, pulled inside by the smell of heat and the sight of light through the chapel's broken glass. Then his mother. Then a widow with red eyes and quiet shoes. By noon, a dozen souls sat scattered in the pews, not for prayer, just for warmth. Some stared at the fire, some dozed, some whispered. None asked questions. Bridget poured coffee with shaking hands. Her fingers blistered, but her heart was steady. She hadn't brought revival. She'd brought refuge, and for now that was enough. That evening, as she swept snow from the chapel steps, Callahan appeared at the edge of the path. He stood in silence. She looked up. Come to pray? He shook his head. Came to see if the damn place would fall over. She smiled. And did it? He stepped forward. No, he admitted. But it might just bring this town back to life. She met his eyes, and for the first time since she arrived, he didn't look away. It began with a cough. Not from Bridget, not from Callahan, but from the little boy who'd found warmth first in her chapel. His name was Tommy, and his cheeks had been red for days, his eyes a bit too glassy. Now that cough had grown sharp, wet, dangerous. By the time his mother brought him back to the church that morning, the snow had turned gray, the sky stained with the color of steel, and the wind sang like a warning. "He's burning up," the woman whispered, pressing the boy into Bridget's arms. Bridget felt it instantly. Tommy's forehead was fire, and there was no doctor in Coldwater Ridge. Not anymore. She carried the child into the sacristy behind the chapel, where she'd set up cots for the weary, covered him with every wool blanket they had, boiled snow for steam, crushed willow bark she'd found dried in the shed. Callahan came an hour later, soaked and silent. "Storm's coming hard," he said, kicking snow off his boots. "Wind'll close the roads by nightfall." Bridget didn't answer. She was too busy holding Tommy's hand and praying. That night, the storm slammed into the ridge like a beast that had waited too long to feed. Shutters ripped, trees cracked, the chapel roof moaned under the weight of the wind. And Tommy's fever climbed higher. His mother wept in a corner. The firewood dwindled, the blankets grew damp. Bridget didn't sleep. She sang old lullabies in Irish under her breath, as if the child could understand them, as if the wind would listen and soften. At one point, Tommy stirred. His lips parted. He whispered, barely audible, "Is this heaven?" Bridget smiled through tears. "No, little one, but it's the closest we've got out here." In the dark hours before dawn, she finally turned to Callahan. "I need your help." He looked up from where he'd been reinforcing the doors with boards. "Name it." "I need more wood, and milk, and vinegar if the store still has it. Blankets, too, whatever's left." He nodded, already pulling on his coat. She caught his arm. "And I need you to believe." His brows knit. "In what?" "That we're not just surviving, that we're worth saving." He stared at her for a long time, then said, soft and low, "You've already convinced me." And with that, he stepped into the blizzard. He came back hours later, covered in ice and bleeding from one knuckle, carrying everything she'd asked for, and more. Bridget didn't speak. She just pressed her hand to his face for a second longer than she needed to, the way someone says thank you when words would break apart. Together, they tended the child, bathed his forehead, fed him sips of broth, kept the fire alive through the coldest night Coldwater Ridge had seen in a decade. And when morning came, pale and shivering, Tommy opened his eyes, smiled, and said, "It's warm now." Bridget laughed, then cried, then laughed again, because life had stayed, because hope had answered, because in a town nearly buried in snow, something had taken root that not even winter could kill. Later that day, as the wind died down and the church began to hum with whispers of life again, Bridget stood by the stove with Callahan beside her. "Still think this town doesn't need a church?" she teased. Callahan looked at her, something unspoken in his eyes. "No," he said. "Now I think it needs you." She looked up sharply, but he was already walking away. The snow had barely begun to melt when a stranger rode into town. Coldwater Ridge rarely saw newcomers in winter, especially not ones with a tailored coat and gloves that hadn't seen work. His horse was fine-boned, Eastern stock, his eyes sharp and searching. He tied the reins at the general store and asked the first person he met, "Is there a chapel here?" And a woman named Bridget Malloy. The storekeeper frowned. "Aye, she's up by the church, helping folks since the storm." The man gave a tight nod, then turned toward the hill. His boots crunched snow like glass. Bridget was hanging blankets to dry in the weak sun when she saw him. She froze, because she knew that silhouette, the straight back, the proud jaw, the hands too soft for tools. She whispered his name like a ghost. "Seamus?" He turned and smiled. "Still remember me, Bridget?" He had been her first love. Back in Galway, Seamus Brennan had walked with books in his arms and ideas too big for their little village. He had promised her a life in Dublin, then in Boston, then wherever dreams dared wander. But when her family fell into debt, and Bridget needed someone to stand beside her, he had vanished like smoke. "I wrote," he said now, voice low. "I waited," she replied, eyes hard. He stepped closer, snow cracking beneath his boots. "I never stopped thinking about you. When I heard you'd crossed the sea, I had to come." She folded her arms. "What do you want?" Seamus looked up toward the chapel, the children laughing inside, the smell of soup on the wind, the silent woodsman moving firewood in the distance. "I want to bring you home." That night, Bridget sat alone in the chapel long after the candles had burned low. Her heart ached with old memories, of laughter by the quay, of dreams drawn on foggy windows, but they felt distant, faded. Outside, she could hear Callahan's quiet footsteps as he made his final rounds. The man who had sheltered her, believed in her, stood beside her in silence, but always steady. She stood, opened the door, and called out softly, "Michael." He turned, one brow raised. She took a long breath. "Would you stay if I asked you to?" He looked at her for a long time, then answered with no hesitation, "I already did." The next morning, Seamus didn't leave. He stayed in town, renting a room above the blacksmith's. He visited the chapel each day, bringing tea, books, and the charm that once made Bridget's heart skip when she was a girl beneath Irish skies. But Bridget wasn't that girl anymore. She had seen hunger, held dying children, built warmth from ash and snow, and while Seamus spoke of velvet parlors and crowded theaters in Boston, her hands were calloused from chopping firewood and mending coats. Still, she listened, because part of her heart remembered what it was like to be loved in poems instead of silence. One evening, as sleet tapped the windows like 100 tiny ghosts, Seamus brought a letter. "It's from Mr. Abrahams," he said, eyes bright. "A schoolmaster in Boston. He heard you were a teacher in Galway. There's a position for you if you'll come back." Bridget stared at the letter. A real post, a real seal, a chance. "I arranged everything," Seamus said, kneeling slightly. "You wouldn't be a mail-order bride. You'd be free, respected, safe." She looked at him for a long time, then folded the letter and tucked it into her apron. Not yes, not no, just undecided. That night she found Michael Callahan in the woodshed, splitting logs by moonlight. The air smelled like cedar and frost. "I had an offer today," she said simply. He didn't stop chopping. "I figured. You're not going to ask what it was?" He paused, looked up. His eyes held the weight of mountains. "No." "Why not?" Callahan set down the axe, stepped closer. "Because you already know what you want. And because if I ask, it might make it harder for you to choose." She blinked. "That's unfairly kind." He shrugged. "I don't fight for people who don't want to stay." Then turned, walking into the dark. But Bridget's voice followed him. "I never said I wanted to leave." The next morning, she found the chapel full of townsfolk. Tommy's mother, the old widow who couldn't carry coal, even the blacksmith with frostbitten hands. They'd come to help, to clean, to bake, to sing. Bridget watched as they lit candles and lifted each other with rough laughter and kind hands. And in that moment, something settled inside her. Not because of Seamus, not because of Michael, but because Coldwater Ridge felt like home, even when it was broken, even when it stormed, especially then. She found Seamus by the station, bags packed, coat pristine. "I'm not going back," she said gently. He opened his mouth, but then saw her eyes, and nodded. "I lost you twice," he murmured. "But I think this time, you found yourself." She reached out, touched his hand. "Thank you for reminding me of where I came from." He smiled, soft, honest. "And thank you for reminding me what a real home looks like." That night, Bridget returned to the chapel porch. Callahan was already there, leaning against the rail, arms crossed. He didn't speak. So she did. "I'm staying." He turned, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled, really smiled, like spring after the longest winter. As the icy grip of winter loosened its hold on Coldwater Ridge, life began to return. Icicles dripped from rooftops in slow rhythm. The creek cracked open with the laughter of melting water. Birds ventured cautious notes into the air, uncertain but hopeful. And Bridget Malloy, once a stranger from across the sea, was now the heart of the town. She spent her mornings teaching the children under patchy rays of sun that spilled through chapel windows. Her afternoons she walked the muddy paths delivering bread and soup, always with a kind word and a glint in her green eyes. Michael Callahan kept working quietly beside her. No promises, no declarations, just presence, solid, real. One afternoon as they stood outside the church watching the children roll snow remnants into soggy balls, Bridget turned to him. "Do you ever wonder if people like us are allowed to be happy?" He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She bit her lip. "We weren't born into comfort. We've had to scrape and suffer. Sometimes it feels like we don't deserve the kind of peace other people do." Callahan paused, then answered slowly. "I think happiness isn't about what you're allowed. It's about what you choose to build." She looked at him, and in his quiet strength, she saw something truer than all the poems Seamus ever wrote. That night, he brought her a gift. A small wooden box carved with vines. Inside a thimble, a locket with no picture, and a folded note. The note read, "There are 3 things I never had before you: hope, rest, and home. If you'll stay, I'll spend my life giving them back." Bridget's hands trembled, not because it was grand, but because it was real. The next day they began working on the old rectory behind the chapel. It had stood abandoned since the war, windows shattered, roof sagging, but the bones were strong. Together they cleared brush, hammered boards, sewed curtains from donated cloth. Neighbors came by, some to help, others just to watch the quiet pair build something that looked a lot like forever. Children called it the Love House. Bridget blushed every time. Callahan didn't correct them. But not all things thaw with spring. And just as blossoms began to bud at the edges of Coldwater Ridge, trouble came riding in. A trio of men on horseback, dust-stained and hard-eyed, stopped at the general store. Their leader, a tall man with a crooked smile and southern drawl, asked one question. "Anyone here know a red-haired Irish girl named Malloy?" The room fell silent. The storm wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The sun had barely crested the ridge when word reached Bridget at the chapel. 3 men asking for her by name. One of them wore a Confederate officer's coat. The other 2 looked like they'd never said please in their lives. Callahan was the first to hear. He didn't say a word, just took off his gloves, laid down the hammer, and went to find her. She met him at the edge of the clearing. Her face was pale, lips tight. "They're here for me," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded once. Not alone this time. They found the men lounging near the store, their horses restless, eyes scanning everything like they owned it. The tall one with the officer's coat stepped forward. His voice was like syrup over rust. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, eyes narrowing on Bridget. "Thought we lost you in the fire. Looks like you got yourself some fans in this little snow puddle." Callahan stepped in front of her. "You got business?" The man laughed. "I was talking to the lady. I'm answering for her." The man's smile didn't fade, but it changed. "Easy there, cowboy. We're just here for something belongs to us." Bridget stepped forward. "You don't own me, Silas." His eyes darkened. "Maybe not, but you've got something that ain't yours. Something you took before disappearing." Bridget's jaw set. "You mean the gold?" Silas chuckled. "You remember after all." Callahan turned to her. "Bridget?" She nodded slowly. "Before the fire, I found where they kept it. Gold stolen from families during the war. I took it, hid it before they could ride me down." Silas leaned closer. "And now you'll tell me where it is." "No," she said. "I burned what I couldn't carry. Gave the rest to a widow with 3 kids in Kansas." A silence fell. Then Silas slapped her. "Fast, loud, brutal." Callahan moved like lightning. He slammed Silas into the hitching post with a force that cracked wood and bone. The other 2 drew their pistols, but found half the townspeople already armed. Michael didn't say a word, just stood over Silas, breathing hard. "Get out," he said. "Tell everyone like you. There's nothing here for cowards who hit women." By dusk, the riders were gone, Silas nursing a broken wrist. Bridget stood beside Callahan as the town slowly returned to its rhythm. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he replied. She placed her hand over his heart. "And not because of the gold?" "No," he whispered. "Because no one touches what's sacred. And Bridget, you are." That night they sat on the chapel steps. Stars blinked through a thin veil of spring clouds. She leaned into his shoulder. "You never asked what I did before coming here," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She smiled. "I think I am." He turned to her, face open, but she didn't speak. Instead, she kissed him, slow, certain, soft. And that said more than any story ever could. Spring had come to Coldwater Ridge, soft and uncertain like a child learning to walk. Grass returned in tufts. Wildflowers dared to bloom again along the hills. But the peace in Bridget's heart was still growing, slow, tender, and stitched together with every look Michael gave her. The townsfolk had begun treating her not like a guest, but like one of their own. And yet, the past had a long reach. It found her again not through riders or violence, but through a letter. It arrived one wet afternoon. The mail was late, brought in on horseback through a trail still half mud, half snow. When Bridget opened the envelope, her breath caught in her throat. The paper smelled faintly of sea salt. "Dearest Bridget, if you're reading this, it means I survived. I don't know if you'll want to see me again. I only know I need to tell you the truth, and that I'm coming." It was signed Seamus O'Rourke, her husband. Bridget sat on the chapel steps, letter trembling in her hands until Michael found her. She handed him the page without speaking. He read it in silence. When he finished, he handed it back and looked out over the hills, then said just 3 words. "Do you want him?" Bridget blinked. "No," she said, voice hoarse. "I want answers, but I don't want him." Michael nodded once. "I'll be here, no matter what those answers are." She reached for his hand, found it already reaching for hers. Days passed. The air warmed, but something hung between them. Not doubt, not jealousy, just the awareness that one thread of her old life was still fraying its way into her new one. When Seamus finally arrived, it wasn't on horseback. It was on foot, tired, lean, and older than she remembered. His eyes searched the chapel yard until they found her. Bridget. She didn't answer. He stepped forward. I need you to know, I never meant to leave you. They caught me. I was imprisoned during the rebellion. Her mouth tightened. You let me believe you were dead. I had no choice. Then why right now? Seamus looked around at the chapel, the repaired schoolhouse, the garden beds. At first, to find you, to ask you back. But now I see you've already gone home. They spoke for an hour. He told her of war, of capture, of regret. She listened, but her heart didn't stir. That part of her life, once full of poetry and ache, was now a closed book. And when Michael stepped outside, Seamus finally understood. You love him, he said. Bridget didn't flinch. I do. Seamus bowed his head. Then I'll leave you to it. When the door closed behind him, she turned to Michael. I hope you know I'm not the same woman who came off that train. Michael pulled her close. I never wanted the girl who arrived in winter. I wanted the woman who stayed through it. Bridget stood in the center of the chapel, surrounded by freshly sanded pews and flower garlands woven by school children. Sunlight fell through the tall windows in golden slants, dancing across the floor like silent music. Michael stood at the doorway, watching her with a quiet reverence that said more than any vow. They weren't planning a wedding. Not yet. What they were building went deeper. Roots before ribbons, trust before ceremony. But Coldwater Ridge had its own rhythm, and whispers traveled faster than rivers. She's no proper wife, some said at the store. Mail-order brides ain't what they used to be, muttered an old rancher. Don't know why Callahan would give his name to a woman with a past thicker than canyon fog. Michael heard it all. So did Bridget, but neither responded. Not in words. They responded with presence, with kindness, with showing up day after day, at the schoolhouse, at town meetings, in line for feed and supplies. They responded by staying together. Then came the first Sunday of the season. The chapel bell rang again, its voice strong and clear. Michael had fixed it himself. That morning the whole town came, not for a sermon. No preacher had come yet, but to see, to decide. Bridget stood at the front with Michael by her side. No dress, no veil, just a linen blouse, a soft shawl, and the weight of every mile she'd walked to get here. She looked at the townsfolk. Faces she once feared, now familiar. Children she'd taught, women she'd helped birth bread with, men who'd nodded to her at the well. And she said, I came here because I had nowhere left to go. I stayed because this place gave me more than safety. It gave me roots. I didn't ask to be loved, but I learned how to love again. And I'm not asking for permission to stay. Then she turned to Michael. I'm just asking you, would you still have me? He didn't smile, didn't joke. He simply stepped forward and took her hand. I already do. No one clapped, no one cheered, but no one walked out either. And when Miss Clara from the bakery cleared her throat and asked, Well, will there be food after this or not? The laughter broke like sunlight through thunderclouds. Later that night, they sat on the chapel steps. Again, Michael leaned close, his voice a whisper only she could hear. You know what I prayed for when I fixed the bell? She shook her head. That you'd stay. She smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. Well, she whispered, you prayed right.